A Christmas Carol has been being adapted for as long as the book has been around. I don't even mean that figuratively. The book was published on December 19th, 1843, and by February 1844, at least two separate theatrical versions existed. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Colin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. The very first adaptations of A Christmas Carol. Of the two existing Christmas Carol plays we have from 1844, we know that one was licensed by Charles Dickens, and there may have been even more than these two. Victorian Web suggests there were, but I can't find any names or information on those. Some say there were as many as 8, but we're going to talk about the two we do know for sure existed. We know because we've got the whole script available for each. As to which came first, it's actually a little murky. At least one of the plays premiered on February 5th. Obviously, we're talking about history that's 180 years old and is hard to verify without first-hand evidence, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'll give you the short version. Author Charles Zachary C.Z. Barnett, the brother of composer John Barnett, wrote a play called A Christmas Carol, or The Miser's Warning. On a cover sheet of the play that I found online, it says that it was first performed on February 5th, 1844, at the Royal Surrey Theatre. The second play, A Christmas Carol, or Past, Present, and Future, a Burletta in 3 Staves, was written by Edward Stirling and officially licensed by Charles Dickens. This premiered at the Adelphi Theatre. I have seen confirmed posters that advertise it being performed on February 19th and February 26th, but there are some sources that claim it also premiered on February 5th. I've seen a poster for purchase that has this date, but it is clearly a recreation, and I can't prove it's word for word from a real one. For one thing, the real ones put Christmas Carol in big letters, and the word A above it in small ones. Well, the one you can buy puts A Christmas Carol all on one line in big letters. I am by no means saying this makes it fake, but it's curious. It would, of course, make sense if there was an unlicensed version taking off and Dickens quickly rushed to license a real one. Either way, we are talking about competing versions of A Christmas Carol from the second month of 1844. I'm not going to try to go into details beyond that because it would be a long rabbit hole and there wouldn't really be a lot gained from it. I'm going to refer to the two plays as the Barnett version and the Stirling version, and we will start with the Barnett, the version that most likely came first. We do have a LibriVox recording of the Barnett version with different actors reading the parts, which is at least something. So I'm going to link to that. If you'd like to check it out, you can listen to the whole thing. And I'm going to link to the full text of both versions as well. Taking a look at the cast list of the original play and the introduction to the play itself, we already have something quite amusing. All of the male characters get their clothes described in some great detail. Scrooge, brown, old-fashioned coat, tea-color breeches, double-breasted white waistcoat. Mr. Fezziwig, black coat, black breeches, double-breasted waistcoat, and striped stockings. Marley's Ghost, slate-colored coat, waistcoat and pantaloons, black boots, white frill, white hand. And then the list of outfits gets wrapped up at the end with all the ladies, modern dresses. Modern dresses, no need to have detail there, right? I mean, it wouldn't matter if you had just listed all the men's costumes in great detail. But the fact that you go into every last detail of every man's pieces of clothing, and then it's like, ladies, dresses. Taking a look at the character lists, we also notice some changes to the source material. Scrooge's nephew Fred becomes Frank, and is given the last name of Freeheart, a rather on-the-nose choice. Scrooge's love interest Belle is also changed to Ellen, and the charity workers get the names of Cheerly and Heartily. There's a character called, Dark Sam. He ends up being one of the people who sells Scrooge's things to Old Joe, and he also pickpockets Bob Cratchit at one point. To be fair to the author here, no one ever calls him by this name, and his race is never as much as alluded to. It's more than I can say about the second play. So let's just say that there's an unfortunate name you wouldn't give a character today. We open in the counting house where Scrooge and Bob Cratchit are working. A lot of the setup for Scrooge's character involves Scrooge addressing the audience directly, using a version of the text that opens the book. Look, this is from nearly 200 years ago. I'm not here to criticize dramatic conventions from before my great-great-grandparents were born, but it does read a tad awkwardly today when a character like Scrooge just tells us who he is. This is one of his opening lines. Marley has been dead 7 years, and has left me his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner, my poor old partner. I was sorely grieved at his death, and shall never forget his funeral. Coming from it, I made one of the best bargains I ever made. Ha ha, folks say I'm tight. And he goes on like that and continues talking about how he's a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, clutching miser, etc. Bob Cratchit also has an early aside where he says, Marley's dead. His late partner is as dead as a doornail. If he was to follow him, it wouldn't matter much. It feels a bit out of character, perhaps, for Bob, but this is essentially an externalization of his internal thoughts, and presumably no one is hearing him, so yeah, it works okay. The scene with Scrooge's nephew plays out like we expect. The comings and goings in the early part of the book are quite easy to do on stage, of course, but there is one over-the-top bit where Bob says goodbye to the nephew, Frank. The same to you, sir, and many of 'em, and to your wife, and to your darling children, and to all your friends, and to all you know, and to everyone in the world. Laying it on a bit thick there, Bob? Speaking of thick, Bob also has some choice words about the charity workers when they come in. 2 gentlemen want you, sir, as fat as prized beef. Shall I call 'em in? That's right, Bob Cratchit likes to fat shame in this version. I kid, maybe as fat as prized beef is meant to be a compliment. I don't know, it's just odd. There are a few adaptations of the story that feel like they need to add more to the nephew's predicament so Scrooge can do more for him. Fred is usually presented as a fairly well-off, happy character. He's got a good wife, they've got a good marriage, not a lot of difficulty that we're aware of in his life, and he just wants to have a friendship with his uncle. I think that's a great character, honestly, but there are versions that feel the need to add. 2 versions I've talked about added a subplot where Fred was unmarried and couldn't marry the woman he loved because he didn't have enough money. And this play adds a subplot where the nephew is in the shipping business and one of his ships is lost at sea. Somehow, in a very contrived manner, Scrooge finds out about this before the nephew, via a letter that Cratchit hands him, and he vows to do nothing for Frank, who also has children in this version. It amps up the stakes between Scrooge and his nephew, but there was already enough tension there, wasn't there? I don't know. I get why this play adds it, but it's never something that feels necessary. Scrooge lives in his counting house in this version, which was also the case in the original TV version of The Stingiest Man in Town, as well as the 1913 silent film with Seymour Hicks. That version, the silent one, took inspiration from a turn-of-the-century play by J.C. Buckstone, where that was also the case, and, of course, it is easy to see why stage versions would choose to do this. It does rob us of Marley on the door knocker, but it's not like that would be easy to do on stage in the 19th century, early 20th anyway. Instead, in the Barnett play, we just have Scrooge say, "'Tis strange now, the idea of Marley is haunting me tonight. Everywhere, turn his face seems before me. Delusion. Humbug." The Marley scene we get is pretty quick, keeping the basics while still moving things along. We do, however, get the wandering spirits, or at least a reference to them. Scrooge says, "It is gone. The air seems filled with phantoms, shades of many I knew when living. They all wear chains like Marley. They strive to assist the poor and stricken, but in vain. They seek to interfere for good in human nature, but have lost the power forever." Again, We have Scrooge saying lines that the narrator of the book originally said, which is kind of an awkward necessity, I suppose. I just wish they had rewritten the words to sound more like they're coming from Ebenezer Scrooge. It reminds me of that really cringy line in the 1935 film when Scrooge said, "Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." He just wouldn't talk that way. We're told that the ghost of Christmas past rises through a trapdoor and appears before Scrooge. The costume design that we get as well feels right out of the book, but they obviously can't do the changing faces thing. And it does appear that, at least in the original production of this play, the ghost was played by a man. And I know there's the whole thing about in Shakespeare's day, women weren't on the stage, but by this era, the Victorian era, there were women in this play. Female actresses played the female parts, and as well as some of the young children, male and female. When Scrooge is all alone at school, we see the various literary characters coming to life. Ali Baba, Valentine and Orson, and Robinson Crusoe and Friday. This is almost never adapted, but yet we get it both here and in the Stirling play. What is it about this scene in particular that was so popular then, but then almost was never adapted after that? To be fair, the narrator of the book does spend quite some time on it, and it was really the only escape that young Scrooge had when he was left all alone. It's obviously an important part of his development, and it also shows that he had quite a bit of fancy as a young boy, something the narrator points out he doesn't have as an old man. There are film and TV versions that have it, of course. The George C. Scott one has a discussion about it. The characters don't appear, but the spirit is still there. And we see the characters above Scrooge's head in his imagination in the Richard Williams cartoon from 1971. They even appear in the 1982 animated film. And there's an upcoming version for season 3 of this show that has a very sweet twist on it, but it's very rare we get this scene. The fact that it's in both play versions from this time means it really must have meant something to the people of the time. I mean, of course, it may be nothing more that 1844 audiences were more familiar with these characters than 20th or 21st century ones, but it's still of note. I find it really interesting that these two versions both had those literary characters coming to life on stage. This is immediately followed by a brief meeting with Fan, or Fanny here, who gets a single line of dialogue. We get a brief scene of Fezziwigs. No one has any lines, save for old Scrooge talking about it. And we get the breakup with Ellen. Again, who knows how long this would have gone on stage, but just reading the dialogue and stage directions, the past feels quite rushed here. We get the general idea, but nothing really feels lived in. The breakup scene appears to at least have some of the time it deserves, which is something. The ghost threatens to show him the scene of Ellen and her current home life, but Scrooge snuffs the ghost out before that's possible. Well, it at least confirmed she was happily married. After this, we switch to the streets of London, where we meet the aforementioned Dark Sam. He's talking to himself about how he hasn't been able to pick anybody's pockets, and then we see Bob Cratchit talking to himself about how he has enough money to buy Christmas dinner. While he's monologuing about this, Sam picks his pocket, and when Cratchit notices it, he says it must have been one of the boys he was sliding with on Cornhill. Then the nephew Frank sees what has happened and loans Bob a sovereign to buy Christmas dinner for his family, saying he could pay it back when Scrooge raises his salary. Ostensibly, never. The scene really doesn't add much of substance to the story. Now, I think it could have. It makes Bob's predicament even sadder, but that's cured right away. What I find particularly odd is the treatment of the nephew. He still doesn't know his ship is lost at sea, and that his finances are a disaster. If he did, then him paying for Bob Cratchit's dinner would show that even when his finances are not good, he's still this same kind of giving person who acts out of the kindness of his heart, not his bank account. Why didn't they do this? As it is, it just shows what we already know about him, and it doesn't reveal anything new. I imagine, this is total speculation, but I imagine this scene exists just to kill some time, so they can set up Scrooge's room for the Ghost of Christmas Present, since we're not at the act break yet. The line Bob says about the nephew Frank has also aged kind of hilariously. He's a regular Trump. Okay, even before the current guy took any positive meaning out of the word, I think the Merriam-Webster definition of Trump as, quote, a dependable and exemplary person was fairly out of fashion. But yes, this is meant as a compliment here. The Ghost of Christmas Present appears similarly to the book, as a flash of bright light reveals him, and we see all the food and everything on stage, which does suggest that maybe that's why they had that other scene to set up Scrooge's room to look like a place that the Ghost of Christmas Present would inhabit. First, the ghost takes Scrooge to a cabin where miners live, and the ghost also describes a scene at a lighthouse. Obviously, the visuals would be limited on stage, but it's cool that we get this. The first act ends with a brief scene of Frank, where we see him raise a toast to his uncle. He also has the two charity workers as guests, which is probably just a way to condense the number of actors and or costumes, but it makes sense. The scene then ends with Frank getting the letter and learning about the lost ship. This is where the act break comes, and it's admittedly pretty late in the story, but it does appear that the yet to come scenes really do take their time, so does all right there. When we come back, we're at the Cratchit house. Scrooge addresses the spirit, much in the same way he directly addressed the audience at the beginning of the play, which serves to introduce Act 2. So, this is my clerk's dwelling spirit, Bob Cratchit's. You blessed it with the sprinkling of your torch as we passed the threshold. Bob had but 15 bob a week. His pockets on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the Ghost of Christmas Present blessed his four-roomed house. Tiny's hymn is even less of a character here than in the book, as he has no lines of his own. The iconic God bless us everyone is nowhere to be found. And maybe it hadn't quite taken off in pop culture yet like it has today. There are lines where all the children speak as one, but outside of this, he's completely silent. Unfortunately, this makes him quite literally nothing more than a plot device. Also, we have no indication about how the children feel regarding the toast to Scrooge, as only Mrs. Cratchit speaks up, and there's no direction for the others. After this scene, we have Scrooge mention that they went a lot of places in Christmas Present, presumably during that act break, and we even get Ignorance and Want, which means this very brief scene has a lot of entrances and exits. It appears that they merely exit the stage, Christmas Present drops through a trapdoor, and Christmas Yet to Come rises up from behind him. This would have been very impressive, I imagine. We actually get a version of all the scenes from the future in the book, which is rare for any adaptation. Instead of fellow banker types talking about Scrooge's death, it's the charity workers here, which is a bit odd. They're being all cold and callous, and that doesn't fit their personality. Also, one of them mentions sarcastically that he was one of Scrooge's closest friends, a line from one of the bankers in the book, and the other one points out that that guy used to say, "How do you do?" to him, but did they? They didn't know him when they entered the counting house. Maybe they got in the habit of saying hello to him after this in this alternate future. In the old Joe scene, we see that Dark Sam works for him, but that's all the more we get of his character. Mrs. Dilber also becomes Mrs. Dibbler in one of those arbitrary changes that makes me wonder if it was a typo. Another woman is also given the name Mrs. Mildew because this version really likes on-the-nose naming. After this, Scrooge sees the body under a sheet and asks to see someone who feels emotion about this man's death. Unlike so many film and TV versions, we get a spin on the scene where a couple is relieved that Scrooge has died because their next creditor may be kinder. It's that great little scene, I always love seeing it, but here that couple is Scrooge's old love interest and her new husband. Well, that's odd. What's also odd is that the wife in the book scene is named Caroline, and it's of course Ellen here, but Caroline then becomes the name of Fred's wife. Why all these name changes? They're so arbitrary. Look, having this woman be Scrooge's former love could have been something, an interesting angle, but They don't do anything with it. It's not mentioned by either her or Scrooge. If it's an attempt to lower the number of actors, why not just make it the same actors playing a different character? I can see why this particular character's happiness about Scrooge's death could add to the drama, but that's not as much as hinted at. It's pretty frustrating to read. Maybe, again, they workshopped this and it was different on stage. I don't know. I hope so. We then get the Cratchit scene and Scrooge in the graveyard. It does look like at least the graveyard is really taking its time, so I appreciate both that scene on its own and the whole of this future really taking its time, building atmosphere, building drama. Again, as far as I can tell from only text. Past felt a bit rushed, but present and future do pretty good. It does, however, look like Christmas morning wraps up pretty quickly. Scrooge gets his big redemption scene in the morning, and he talks to the boy on the street. But they wrap everything up right at his house. First, Bob shows up and says Frank is ruined, which is odd since Scrooge already knew that. He got the letter from Bob. Maybe Bob hadn't read it and then Frank told Bob. I'm not sure. Then Frank shows up simply to tell his uncle that he's leaving London because he's broke. Scrooge promises that he'll give him all the money he needs for his losses and leave him everything when he dies. And he goes on to vow that Tiny Tim will get better and he'll raise Bob's salary. Obviously, I'm not able to see a play version of this, so I can't review it in that way. But I still think it's interesting to see what one of the earliest, if not the earliest, adaptation of A Christmas Carol looked like. Yet to come is often the sequence that gets the short end of the stick in later versions, so it gets a lot of focus here, and I find that really interesting. Because of this, I would at least have to imagine that this play version did a really good job of building moody atmosphere. Of course, being a stage version from this time, there's less of the outdoor street scenes, even though that one scene with Bob Cratchit being pickpocketed on the street is added. That whole subplot really adds nothing, even though it could have served to show us what a giving person the nephew would be, even without money. As it is, it's just filler. Overall, this does feel like a version that was written in a hurry to capitalize on a successful book, which, let's be honest here, it probably was. Want even more Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast? You can follow me on Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get access to all episodes 24 hours early. For $5 a month, you will also get a bonus episode every month about a TV episode based on A Christmas Carol. And for $10 a month, you'll even get the right to vote in polls. Just go to patreon.com/Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Now we can talk about the Stirling version, which came out around the same time. According to author Stirling, Dickens offered some, quote, valuable suggestions to the writing and development of the play, although when he did see the finished product, his letters suggest that he neither loved nor hated it. The word I've seen, but I don't think it's a quote from the letters, is mixed. While the Barnett play started with a brief discussion about coal before the characters told us directly who Scrooge was, this one feels a bit more natural. Scrooge still talks to himself, but it's more in line with his character and what he would say while still informing us of who he is. This is a quote from Scrooge at the beginning. Losses, losses. There it is to trade, to venture one's gold in merchandise, to risk the gains of a life upon the treacherous deep. Draw, as it were, the ends of the earth together, and for what? To feed cormorants with luxuries they never intend to pay for? Old Marley was too lenient. If he had lived much longer, the firm of Scrooge, Marley and Company would have figured in the Gazette. It's not awkwardly forcing the book's narration into dialogue, which almost always comes off as stilted. Like I've said before, the writing in A Christmas Carol is beautiful, but that doesn't mean you should force it into your script. The Fred scene here, and yes, thankfully he is actually Fred in this play, is very similar to the wording from the book, and it works. It's dialogue, and it's dialogue here. That works. Instead of having the charity workers as characters, we have Bob dropping off a letter from them and having essentially the same exchange with Scrooge that they have with him in the book. Hey, there's something else that Ron Barge stole for Buccaneer Scrooge. After this scene, though, Bob does finally use a bit of the book's narration to describe Scrooge. Maybe it works a little better here, though, since Scrooge has just turned down the charity workers and insisted Cratchit comes in early the day after Christmas. Here's how Bob describes him. What a flint heart. No warmth could warm or wintry weather chill him. He buttons himself up so tight in his selfishness that no good feeling could possibly melt his heart. Even foul weather don't know where to have him. The heaviest rain that ever rained and the snow that ever snowed have only one advantage over him. They always come down handsomely. Scrooge never does. I also think it's just worded a little better. It's not as pointed as Bob's criticism in the Barnett play. Also, like in the Barnett play, Scrooge lives in his counting house. There's already plenty of moving in this play, so totally get this being the norm for stage versions. It's always going to bug me in film and TV, though. Scrooge starts talking to himself about Marley's death being on a night like this, and that's when Marley appears. It is very odd, though, when Scrooge says, "It's old Marley come back," before asking the ghost who he is. I know that he doesn't want to believe his eyes, but he's literally already identified him. Also, this version keeps the "no bowels" line from the book, quite a rarity, but of course, the pun probably went over better in the time it was written. The Marley scene really takes its time, which is always nice. Sometimes it goes by way too fast. We get the wandering spirits again, too, although Scrooge just describes them out a window. Clearly, there was a time when this was a crucial part of the story. When did we lose this? Marley being just one of many only adds to the sadness and haunting nature of the story. We don't get any detailed costume descriptions in the script here, so we're not told how the Ghost of Christmas Past looked. It does say the ghost rises, though, so I imagine that once again there were trapdoors at play. Like in the Barnett play, we start with the boy at school, and again, we see Ali Baba and other characters come to life. However, these past scenes have more in the way of dialogue, with lines for the headmaster and the postboy, letting it all breathe a bit more, which is admirable. It's not just see that, see this now, we're done. However, once we get to Fezziwigs, there is a choice I don't understand. We see Scrooge and Dick Wilkins preparing Fezziwigs for the Christmas Eve party. Then Scrooge's love interest enters and breaks things off with him, and then we see Fezziwig's jolly party. Apart from the issues with character development, this is some serious mood whiplash. Also, Scrooge's love interest is named Bella here, because they always have to be changing the name for a small and arbitrary reason. Why is Bella breaking up with the Scrooge who would then go on to enjoy Fezziwig's party? He can't be obsessed with money yet. He works for Fezziwig and he has that fun-loving spirit. This makes no sense. Also, like in the Barnett play, we get a passing reference to the love interest now being happily married, but we're not taken to the scene. After this, Scrooge is back in bed, and he calls it all a humbug, which is very much not where the book Scrooge is at this point. The Ghost of Christmas Present appears and has a whole song. This is odd because there are no other original songs in the whole thing, though there are at least carols mentioned that are sung. It's not completely out of nowhere, but it's a mildly out of nowhere kind of situation. The text links this song to the writings of Edward Fitzball, but I can't find this specific poem credited to him anywhere, or find it in any other context at all when I Google it. He wrote plays that opened at the same theater, so I'm guessing that he just wrote this little song for the play, but again, I am just guessing. The song is mainly just describing Christmas and how great it is. Maybe, in fact, the first Ain't Christmas Grand song in the history of A Christmas Carol. In this version, we do get the ghost and Scrooge walking the streets on Christmas Day, and we even get Fred and his wife interacting with Bob on the streets, not unlike the 1938 film. Scrooge had turned away some carolers the night before, and here he sees Bob Cratchit giving those same carolers something. The scene at the Cratchit home plays out much like the book, although again, there's no God bless us everyone. This does seem like it should have called on right away as part of A Christmas Carol. Since the book ends in a callback to it, Dickens clearly liked the line, but it wasn't so entwined with the public perception of the work that an adaptation had to include it. There's reference to it at the end we get, but it's not the line directly. We'll get back to that at the end, of course. However, there's another small change that is much more jarring. Mrs. Cratchit uses the N-word. Yeah, so that's there. Warning for anyone who seeks this version out to read. Mrs. Cratchit could have used any language to explain how hard Scrooge makes her husband work, but yeah, she's super racist about it. Thankfully, we get a long version of the ghost tearing into Scrooge for his surplus population line, and this is followed by Scrooge seeing miners underground, and it's perhaps the longest version of this scene ever. It's definitely the longest I've encountered. The character of Will is talking to his wife Katie about how hard they have it, but they want to make the most of it being Christmas anyway. Then another miner comes in and says everyone is off for the holiday. Will does come off a little condescending towards his wife, saying things like she was always supposed to be a cheerful helpmate to him, but overall it does capture that everyone feels like Christmas vibe of the book, no matter where they are, so it's a really nice little scene. We also get a brief version of the lighthouse scene, and it's not described in detail how they did this on stage, but it appears that the ghost directs Scrooge to look at the lighthouse, so it must just be a piece of scenery, and then the voices come from off stage singing a Christmas carol. It is here, by the ocean, where we meet ignorance and want, and where the ghost eventually departs. I kind of love this. It's even more eerie than being abandoned in downtown London. Being abandoned at night by a stormy sea, pretty horrifying. We also hear sailors singing during this too, meaning we get all three of those Christmas scenes from the book in one way. We end up not having a scene at Fred's party, but Fred still had some of those same lines and sentiments in the street scene, so that works. The Christmas Yet to Come scenes play out a little bit differently than usual. First, the ghost shows Scrooge two men outside the exchange. Interestingly, one of them is named Topper, which is one of Fred's guests in the book. I guess they just liked the name enough to use it somewhere else. Upon seeing this, Scrooge asks to see some tenderness connected with death and is taken to the Cratchits. Scrooge uses that cringy, childish essence line from the book here, much like in the 1935 film. Again, why would anyone think Scrooge talks like this? After this, the spirit takes him to Old Joe's, which is odd since there's no specific reason to transition there at this point. Nothing wrong with it, of course, it just seems to be mixing up the order without specific rhyme or reason. It very well could be to set the scenes a certain way on the stage. Of course, there have been all kinds of ways that Christmas Yet to Come has been done on film, but I can usually pinpoint why they do it that way. The George C. Scott version moves up the body under the sheet, so Scrooge's request for emotion for this man's death can take him to Old Joe's. The Alistair Sim one starts with the Cratchits to build attention to the obviousness of Scrooge's death. Here, I'm not sure. Also, Mrs. Dilber again becomes Mrs. Dibbler here. Two B's this time instead of one, so now I'm very curious what this is all about. Was there a real life Dilber who was not a fan of her name being used in the book or something? This one does a particularly good job of showing that the tragedy is that Scrooge dies alone with no one to mourn him. And Scrooge even points out this when he sees his name on the gravestone. Obviously, it depends on the scene setting and the actors, but both of these plays have graveyard scenes that read as effective to me. The Christmas morning scenes play out a little awkwardly on paper. Maybe they just worked fine on stage, but something is weird in the reading here. The boy that Scrooge tells to go buy the turkey is Peter Cratchit. Scrooge doesn't seem to know that this is Bob Cratchit's son, even though he just saw him in a couple of visions. Then, as he's planning to send the turkey to Bob, he sees Bob on the street with Tiny Tim, welcomes into his house. How convenient. Right there, he raises his salary. He also seems to outright say he wants to be a second father to not just Tiny Tim, but all of Bob's children, which reads as odd in the present tense. Knowing he did it in the future, great. I love that Dickens tells us that, but saying I want to be after how he's been for the last years to Bob never works. After this, they apparently all go to Fred's, and they have their ending there, so it's a little confusing when you read it. I kind of had to read part of it out loud to figure out what exactly was going on in this ending. The stage directions aren't exactly clear, but it appears that he sees Bob, Tiny Tim on the street, and I guess Peter still getting the turkey, but they work that out off screen. Then they all go to Fred's. He makes up with Fred. He has his ending. And the final line is, "Heaven bless us, everyone." But Tiny Tim didn't say that earlier. It is Tiny Tim's line here, though. If I had to guess, they weren't allowed to say God in any context on stage. I suppose that would be why Scrooge's line earlier is saying Tiny Tim's childish essence was from heaven instead of God. But, again, speculation. We do know that this version was revived in 1859, 15 years after it first premiered. It doesn't appear that this or the other play has ever been revived in recent times, at least not in a major way, which makes sense since the book itself is in the public domain. You can go make your own adaptation right now for free. It is interesting to see which choices were made in these early theater versions, many of them likely for convenience, such as Scrooge living in his counting house. If you want to read these, they're both in the public domain as well. I'll link to the full versions you can find online, in addition to the audio recording of that one version. Going solely by what's on the page, the Stirling one feels more inspired and lived in, with longer scenes and more fully realized characters. But I have a slight preference to the way the Barnett play handles yet to come. Bob comes off much differently in the Barnett one, and the additional storyline for Fred there doesn't add much at all. I much prefer the little scenes we get to build the world in the Stirling play, like the miner and his wife, as opposed to those scenes with the pickpocket, which really don't do anything at all. Next month, it is the first Christmas Carol sequel that I have covered. There are all kinds of Christmas Carol sequels in various media, film, novels, and I figured I should cover those at some point. Again, that's not something I include on the main show because it's not an adaptation of A Christmas Carol in the traditional sense, but I'm going to talk about my first Christmas Carol sequel next month. It is a 2013 film called Mr. Scrooge to See You, and we will talk about that then. We are just a couple months away, believe it or not, from the beginning of Season 3 of Scrooge A Christmas Carol podcast. This one is going to start right where the last one left off, of course, as we go into the 90s and up through the early 2000s, ending with Christmas Carol, the movie from 2001. It's not necessarily like a big landmark like Muppets was. It's just the place have decided to end this season based on the number of adaptations I'll be reviewing. And this season is going to be called Not Your Father's Ebenezer Scrooge because we've got all kinds of Scrooges here. Genie's out of the bottle here, and anything goes when it comes to Scrooges. So stay tuned for that in a couple of months. I've been writing the season, watching versions. I have one version I've written about. It is the most words I've had to say about any version so far. It's like 1,000 words more than the one on my favorite version. Doesn't mean it's my new favorite, but yeah, it's going to be a very interesting season. So hope you'll stay tuned for that because we're exiting kind of the part of mainstream Christmas carols. Like everyone knows the Muppets, everyone knows Mickey, most people know the George C. Scott one and Scrooged. Now we're really going off into these more niche Christmas carols as more cable channels began to evolve, more direct to video, so many more options with Christmas carols. And I'm going to be covering everything from 1992 up through 2001. You can stay tuned for a few additional thoughts on these two play versions, and thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. So, I had always wondered if I wanted to do an episode on these play versions. I had a version of the first episodes of this where I was like, should I talk about silent versions or talk about play versions? And I cut that all out of my first episode, besides just brief mentions, because I really wanted to start with the first two sound versions again. Talked about this during my silent movie episodes as well, that the place to start was those first two 1930s versions and go from there, because otherwise you're just going down roads that can be interesting. I think they're interesting, but they're not really the place to start, and you take way too long to get to where you need to be, and you need to start with those film versions. So that's why I didn't talk about those before, but I'm talking about them now. Yeah, two of the sources I read, and I'm sure they're getting their information from the same place or one's getting it from the other, said that as many as 8 versions popped up within months of the book being released, and I have no idea if that's true. I can't find any source backing that up. Of course, I'm doing basic research. I'm not doing extensive research for these. I mostly just want to talk about the text of the play, not going down deep dives and buying books just to see if I can find one piece of information. This is not really a history podcast in that way, so I don't always do that. But if you know more about these, feel free to let me know. But these are the two that we have the text of, so I figured we'd just talk about them. I had assumed they were the first two versions. It's possible they weren't. But as far as I know, these are the two earliest existing versions of A Christmas Carol, and the first two in any format, really, outside of the book. So Dickens would go on to do readings of the book, but believe that was later as well. So he did license uh, the Stirling one. Yeah, if you're gonna just read one of these two and you're interested, I would recommend the Stirling one just because it's more interesting. But again, be warned, there is that one racial slur in there, which it has that scene with the miners, which is quite interesting. Which it has a whole little scene. I've never really seen a little scene there. I've always just seen these are miners, if it does it at all, and they sing a song maybe. But yeah, it has a whole exchange, which is nice. And it also has the Ghost of Christmas Present singing that song, which I think is the first Ain't Christmas Grand song in the history of A Christmas Carol. It set the tradition of gotta have at least one song in every musical version, or in this case, not even a musical, about how great Christmas is. So I'll read a bit of it here if you're curious. Though the wind blow, the snow fall, we laugh at old care today. They're dancing and singing in bower and hall, and we'll be as merry as they. The mistletoe hangs on the rafters high. Fill, fill every flagon with cheer, for Christmas was meant for jollity, and cometh but once a year. And it has three whole verses and choruses, so it just seems to be a thing. I mean, I get it. You're gonna write a song about Christmas. It's not gonna be specifically about like Jesus, and the whole ghost thing is Ghost of Christmas Present, loving Christmas. It's probably going to come across that way, but wow, it is interesting that this very specific kind of Christmas Carol Christmas song dates back to 1844. And I realize there are plenty of Ain't Christmas Grand songs that do not exist in the context of A Christmas Carol. But there are so many in the context of A Christmas Carol. They could get their own video. Maybe that's another video I'll do. I don't know. But it's it's a kind of Christmas song. I worked in retail for a couple of years, and Christmas specifically, I never got turned off to the holiday working in retail myself. That's something I never wanted to be. I saw people be cynical, and like that's not how I want to be. I'm going to get through it. I'm going to survive some of the bad music, and I like plenty of Christmas music still. But you laugh at it, you make light of it, you get through, you enjoy the parts of the season when you're not working. But the songs that are just listing things that happen at Christmas, they did drive me up a wall. There's exceptions, but for the most part, that kind of song is the worst kind of Christmas song. So it's only appropriate that I keep encountering them in these Christmas carols. Uh, and again, from the very beginning of the adaptation cycle, it appears that this was a kind of Christmas song you just had to put in. December the 25th from Scrooge is kind of one of those, and I love that song. So it's not like they're all awful, but it's often going to turn me off. And I imagine this would probably be the same if I saw this play. I would just be like, why are we doing this song? Yeah, obviously, these are tougher to review because we're looking at just the text of a play and reading a play just as text to yourself, even without different people reading the different parts. It's going to be harder to get a grasp of what exactly they were going for, even without the visuals. So I take that into consideration. When I read Shakespeare for my Shakespeare course in college, I would try sometimes to like seek out online versions of the plays to watch because reading them, it was just not the same experience. And with these, they're so obscure you can't find those. If there were versions available to watch online, I would have gone and done that for this instead or alongside it. But there aren't. There's that one audiobook version, and that's it. So I just read them. Not the ideal way to do it, but At least we have these. We don't even have the Buckstone play, to my knowledge, from 1901, which is apparently a big inspiration of those silent films. So, wish I could find that one. But we do have these too, which is very cool. I love stuff like this. It's obscure, it's interesting, shows us an idea of what early versions of A Christmas Carol thought was important. So, yeah. Check them out if you want. I have the links to them here. Thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Colin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. You can also back me on Patreon for early episodes, bonus episodes, and the right to vote in polls. Link is in the description. I'll be back next month with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.